The morning air felt cold and crisp as people hurried through the gates of the Harrington Music Academy. It was one of those fancy buildings that made you feel small just by looking at it. Tall white columns stood at the entrance, and the walls were covered in photos of famous musicians who had studied there over the years. Inside the main hallway, nervous teenagers sat on wooden benches, waiting for their turn to audition. Some practiced fingering patterns in the air. Others whispered to their parents, asking for last-minute encouragement. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Among all these hopeful faces sat a 17-year-old girl named Maya. She looked calm compared to everyone else around her. Her long, dark hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a modest blue dress that her mother had helped her pick out the night before. Next to her chair rested a white cane, folded neatly and leaning against the wall. Maya couldn't see the beautiful architecture around her, or the worried expressions on the other candidates' faces. She'd been blind since she was 7 years old, when a rare disease slowly took away her sight. But if you watched her closely, you would notice something interesting. While others fidgeted and paced, Maya sat perfectly still, her hands resting gently in her lap. She seemed to be listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. Maya and her mother had woken up before dawn that morning. They lived in a small town 8 hours away by train, and this audition meant everything to them. The scholarship Maya was competing for would cover 4 years of study at one of the best music schools in the country. Without it, there was no way her family could afford the tuition. Her father worked at a factory and her mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. They had saved every penny they could, but it still wouldn't be enough. This audition was Maya's one shot at making her dream come true. Her mother sat beside her now, holding her hand and trying not to show how nervous she felt. She remembered the day Maya had first asked to learn piano. It was just a few months after losing her sight completely. Most kids would have been devastated, lost in depression and anger. But Maya had heard a piece of classical music on the radio, and something inside her had awakened. She told her mother that even though she couldn't see anymore, she could still hear beauty, and she wanted to create it too. Her parents had found a used piano at a yard sale and brought it home. That old, slightly out-of-tune instrument became Maya's whole world. The other candidates kept glancing at Maya and her cane. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed to be caught staring. Others whispered to their parents, asking questions. A few seemed sympathetic, but most looked confused about why she was even there. One boy sitting across from them leaned over to his father and said loud enough for others to hear that he didn't think blind people could really play piano properly. His father shushed him, but the damage was done. Maya's mother squeezed her daughter's hand tighter, but Maya just smiled softly. She was used to it by now. The audition had attracted students from all over the region. There were kids who had been taking lessons since they were 3 years old. Some came from wealthy families who could afford the best private teachers and the finest instruments. They wore expensive clothes and carried leather music bags filled with perfectly organized sheet music. Maya carried nothing but her cane and her courage. Everything she needed was already inside her head and her heart. A door opened at the end of the hallway, and a woman with a clipboard stepped out. She called out a name, and a nervous-looking girl stood up and walked into the audition room. The door closed behind her and everyone else went back to waiting. The silence in the hallway felt heavy. Minutes passed slowly. Then the door opened again and the girl came out. She was crying, which didn't make anyone else feel better about their chances. Maya knew that inside that room sat 3 judges who would decide her future. She also knew that one of them was Richard Thornwood, a pianist so famous that even people who didn't care about classical music had heard his name. He had played in concert halls around the world. Critics called him a genius. Other musicians spoke about him with a mixture of respect and fear. He was known for being brilliant but also incredibly hard to please. People said he had made grown adults cry with his harsh criticisms. Maya had listened to recordings of his performances countless times. She admired his technical skill, but she had always felt something was missing from his playing. It was perfect but somehow cold, beautiful but distant, like looking at a sculpture instead of a living, breathing person. Another name was called, then another. The hallway slowly emptied as one by one, the candidates went in and came out. Some looked relieved. Others looked crushed. Maya could hear it in their footsteps and in the way they breathed as they passed by her seat. Finally, after what felt like forever, the woman with the clipboard appeared again and called Maya's name. Maya stood up carefully, unfolding her cane with practiced ease. Her mother stood too, taking her daughter's arm gently. Together they walked toward the door, their footsteps echoing in the now half-empty hallway. Maya could feel everyone's eyes on her back. She could sense their curiosity, their doubt, maybe even their pity. But she held her head high and walked forward with steady steps. The audition room was bigger than Maya expected. She could tell by the way sounds echoed differently here. Her mother guided her to a piano bench in the center of the room. Maya sat down carefully, placing her cane beside her. She reached out and felt the smooth wood of the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing down. It was a good instrument. She could tell that much immediately. Across from her, behind a long table, sat the three judges. Richard Thornwood was in the middle, a man in his 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. He looked at Maya and her cane, and something changed in his expression. It wasn't quite disgust, but it definitely wasn't encouragement either. It was the look of someone who had already made up his mind. He glanced at the other two judges with raised eyebrows, a silent communication that said more than words could. One of the other judges, a kind-looking woman, smiled warmly at Maya and asked if she was ready. Maya nodded and said yes, her voice steady despite the nervousness fluttering in her stomach. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling their familiar smoothness under her fingertips. This was the moment she had been preparing for. This was her chance to show them what she could do. But before she could play even a single note, a voice cut through the silence. It was Richard Thornwood, and his question would change everything that came after. Richard Thornwood leaned forward in his chair, his fingers drumming on the table in front of him. The question he asked wasn't what Maya had expected at all. Instead of asking her to begin playing, he wanted to know something else entirely. How could she possibly understand the dynamics written in classical music scores? How could she interpret what the composer truly meant without seeing the actual notation on the page? And then came the question that made the whole room feel smaller. Did she really believe she could compete with students who had the advantage of sight? The words hung in the air like smoke. They weren't shouted or openly cruel, but there was something in his tone that made them sting even worse. It was the kind of condescension that comes from someone who thinks they're being reasonable, even kind, by pointing out what they see as obvious limitations. The other two judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The kind woman who had smiled at Maya earlier looked down at her papers. The third judge, an older man with thick glasses, cleared his throat but said nothing. Nobody challenged Thornwood. Nobody spoke up to defend Maya. He was too important, too respected, too powerful in the music world for anyone to question him. Maya's hands, which had been resting confidently on the piano keys, began to tremble slightly. She could feel her mother tense up by the door, probably fighting the urge to march over and give this famous pianist a piece of her mind. But Maya took a deep breath and steadied herself. She had faced doubt before. She had heard variations of these questions her whole life. People always assumed that being blind meant being limited, incomplete, somehow less capable than everyone else. She turned her head toward where Thornwood's voice had come from and spoke clearly. Her voice was quiet but firm. She explained that she had been learning music since she was 8 years old, just a year after losing her sight. She studied pieces by listening to recordings over and over until she could hear every single note, every pause, every subtle change in tempo and volume. She learned to read music through Braille notation, running her fingers over raised dots that told her what sighted musicians saw on regular sheet music. Her teacher had taught her to understand dynamics not through visual symbols on a page, but through feeling and listening. Music wasn't something you needed eyes to understand, she said. It was something you felt in your bones, in your heart, in your soul. Thornwood listened with his arms crossed over his chest. When Maya finished speaking, he allowed himself a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile adults give to children when they say something naive but earnest. He nodded slowly and gestured toward the piano with one hand, as if granting her permission to proceed. But everything about his body language said he had already made his decision about her. This audition was just a formality now, a box to check so the Academy could say they had given her a fair chance. As Maya positioned her hands back on the keys, she heard him lean over to whisper something to the judge next to him. The acoustics in the room were good, and Maya's hearing had become exceptionally sharp over the years. She caught every word. He said it was unfortunate when misguided hope led to inevitable disappointment. He said it quietly, probably thinking Maya couldn't hear. but his words cut through her like a knife through butter. For a moment, Maya felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel. Anger, not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, determined kind that settles deep in your chest and turns into fuel. She had prepared Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata for this audition. It was a piece she knew inside and out, one she could play flawlessly. Her teacher had helped her choose it specifically because it was technically challenging enough to impress the judges, but also beautiful enough to showcase her musical sensitivity. She had practiced it hundreds of times until her fingers could find every note in her sleep. But something changed in that moment. Sitting there at that piano with Thornwood's dismissive words still echoing in her ears, Maya made a decision that she hadn't planned. Her heart started beating faster, and her mouth felt dry, but she knew with absolute certainty what she needed to do. This wasn't just about getting into a music school anymore. This was about proving something bigger. Not to them, really, but to herself. She needed to show them who she truly was as a musician, not just as someone who could competently perform someone else's work. Maya lifted her hands from the keys and spoke again. This time her voice was stronger, almost defiant. She announced that she wouldn't be playing the Beethoven piece she had prepared. Instead, she would perform something she had written herself. An original composition. The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. The rules of the audition were clear. Students were supposed to perform approved pieces from a specific list of classical works. Deviations weren't allowed. The whole point was to demonstrate technical skill and interpretation of established masterworks. Playing your own composition wasn't part of the program. The kind female judge opened her mouth as if to say something, probably to remind Maya of the rules. But Thornwood raised his hand slightly, stopping her. He looked at Maya with an expression that was hard to read. It might have been curiosity. It might have been amusement at what he saw as a desperate attempt to stand out. Either way, he didn't object. Maybe he wanted to see her fail in an even more spectacular way. Maybe some small part of him was actually interested. Whatever his reason, he nodded for her to continue. Maya's mother clasped her hands together tightly, her knuckles turning white. She had no idea what her daughter was about to do. Maya had never mentioned planning to play an original piece. This was completely spontaneous, driven by emotion and conviction rather than careful preparation. Maya took another deep breath and placed her hands back on the piano. She told them the piece was called Light in the Darkness. She explained in just a few sentences that she had written it 2 years ago after her younger brother died in a car accident. He had been only 12 years old. His name was Danny, and he had been her best friend, her biggest supporter, the one person who never treated her differently because she couldn't see. The piece was her way of processing grief, of finding meaning in loss, of searching for hope when everything felt hopeless. The room felt different now. Even Thornwood's expression had changed slightly. The cynical amusement was gone, replaced by something more complex. The other judges sat up straighter, paying attention in a way they hadn't been before. Maya's mother pressed her hand against her mouth, tears already forming in her eyes. She remembered the months after Danny's death, how Maya had spent hours at the piano, working through her pain the only way she knew how. Maya closed her eyes, though it made no difference to her whether they were open or closed. She took one more breath, letting the silence settle around her like a blanket, and then her fingers descended onto the keys, and the first notes of Light in the Darkness filled the room. From that very first chord, everything changed. The first chord was soft, almost fragile, like the first ray of morning light breaking through darkness. Maya's fingers moved across the keys with a gentleness that made everyone in the room hold their breath. The melody started simply, just a few notes that seemed to ask a question without words. It was the sound of confusion, of a child trying to understand something too big and painful to grasp. The notes floated through the air, filling every corner of the audition room with something raw and honest. Thornwood had been prepared to sit back and wait for this to be over. He had judged hundreds of auditions in his career, maybe thousands. He thought he had seen and heard everything. But something about those opening notes made him pause. There was a vulnerability in the music that caught him off guard. It wasn't the polished, perfect performance he was used to hearing from well-trained students. This was something different, something real. Maya's left hand joined in, providing a deep, steady foundation beneath the searching melody. The bass notes were like a heartbeat, slow and strong, grounding the piece even as the right hand continued to explore and question. She swayed slightly as she played, her whole body connected to the music in a way that seemed almost unconscious. Her face showed every emotion the music carried, When the melody dipped into sadder tones, her eyebrows drew together. When it lifted into something lighter, her expression softened. The piece began to build. The simple melody from the beginning started to develop layers, becoming more complex. Maya's fingers moved faster now, dancing across the keys with a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere beyond technical training. Her right hand played rapid sequences of notes that sparkled and shimmered like light reflecting off water. But underneath, her left hand kept that steady heartbeat going, reminding everyone that even in the most chaotic moments, there was something solid to hold on to. The kind female judge felt tears forming in her eyes. She had been judging auditions for 15 years, and she had heard plenty of talented students play before. But this was different. This wasn't just about talent or skill. This was about truth. Every note Maya played seemed to come straight from her heart, unfiltered and unafraid. The judge found herself thinking about her own losses, her own moments of grief. The music was reaching inside her and touching places she usually kept locked away. Thornwood leaned forward in his chair, his earlier skepticism beginning to crack. He watched Maya's hands move across the keyboard with increasing fascination. There was no hesitation in her playing, no fumbling or searching for the right keys. Her fingers knew exactly where to go, as if the piano was an extension of her own body. But more than that, there was an emotional depth to her performance that he rarely encountered even in professional musicians. She wasn't just playing notes. She was telling a story, painting a picture with sound, making everyone in the room feel what she had felt when she wrote this piece. The music shifted again. The questioning tone from the beginning gave way to something darker, more turbulent. This was the part of the piece that dealt with anger and despair, with the unfairness of losing someone too young. Too suddenly, Maya's playing became more forceful, her fingers striking the keys with passion. The melody twisted and turned, rising and falling like waves in a storm. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, the kind of beauty that hurts to experience because it's so honest about pain. Her mother stood by the door with tears streaming down her face. She remembered the weeks and months after Danny died, how the whole family had struggled to function. Maya had barely eaten, barely slept. But every day she would sit at that old piano for hours, working through her grief the only way she knew how. Her mother had listened through the walls as these same melodies took shape, evolving from scattered notes into something coherent. She had watched her daughter transform pain into art, darkness into light. And now here was Maya, sharing that journey with strangers who had no idea what it had cost her to create this music. The piece climbed toward what felt like a breaking point. The notes became louder, more insistent, building toward a crescendo that filled the entire room. Maya's body moved with the music, leaning into the more powerful passages, pulling back during the softer moments. Sweat began to form on her forehead from the physical and emotional intensity of the performance. Her fingers flew across the keys, executing technically difficult passages that would have challenged even the most skilled pianists. But the technique wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the feeling behind every single note. And then just when it seemed the music might shatter from its own intensity, something remarkable happened. The storm began to calm. The angry, turbulent chords softened. The melody that had been fighting so hard started to find a kind of peace. It wasn't a happy peace, not the kind that pretends pain never existed. It was deeper than that. It was the peace that comes from acceptance, from learning to carry loss without letting it destroy you. The music seemed to say that grief doesn't end, but it transforms. It becomes part of you, woven into who you are, but it doesn't have to be the only thing that defines you. Thornwood felt something he hadn't experienced in years. His eyes began to sting, and he realized with surprise that he was fighting back tears. This famous pianist who had performed for presidents and royalty, who had received standing ovations in the greatest concert halls in the world, was being moved to tears by a 17-year-old blind girl playing a piano in an audition room. He tried to maintain his composure, to hold on to his professional detachment, but the music wouldn't let him. It was too honest, too powerful, too real. The third judge, the older man with thick glasses, had given up trying to hide his emotions. He wiped his eyes openly, not caring what anyone thought. In his 30 years of teaching music, he had never heard anything quite like this. Technical excellence could be taught, but what Maya possessed, this ability to channel pure emotion into music to make listeners feel every note in their souls, that was something you were born with. It was a gift that no amount of training could provide. Maya's playing continued to evolve, moving through different emotional landscapes. There were moments of sadness, yes, but also moments of joy, as she remembered the good times with her brother. There were passages that felt like acceptance, like making peace with what couldn't be changed, and there were moments that felt like hope, like deciding to keep living fully even after experiencing devastating loss. The music became a complete emotional journey, taking everyone in the room through the entire process of grief and healing. Her fingers found their way to the higher registers of the piano, playing notes that sounded like wind chimes or distant bells. These delicate crystalline sounds floated above the deeper harmonies her left hand continued to provide. It was as if she was reaching toward something beyond the immediate pain, beyond the present moment, toward some kind of understanding or meaning that existed just out of reach but was worth striving for. The piece began moving toward its conclusion, though nobody in the room wanted it to end. The melodies that had been so complex and layered started to simplify, coming back to something closer to where the piece had begun. But it wasn't quite the same. The music had traveled too far, experienced too much to return to the beginning unchanged. The final notes were approaching and everyone could feel it. Maya's hands slowed their movement across the keys and the music entered its final phase. What had been a storm of emotion was now becoming something quieter, something more profound. The notes she played seemed to carry the weight of everything that had come before, all the pain and anger and sadness, but also all the love and memories and hope. Her right hand climbed to the highest keys on the piano, finding a single clear note that rang out like a bell in the silence. It hung in the air, pure and bright, seeming to last forever even though it was just a few seconds. Then her left hand came down with one final chord. It was deep and rich, grounding that high note in something solid and real. The two sounds together created a moment of perfect balance. Light and dark, heaven and earth, loss and love existing together in the same space. It was as if Maya was saying through her music that this is what life really is, not just happiness or just sadness, but both at once. Not forgetting the people we've lost, but carrying them with us as we keep moving forward. The chord faded slowly, and Maya lifted her hands from the keys, placing them gently in her lap. The silence that followed was unlike any silence that had ever existed in that audition room before. It was thick and heavy with emotion. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The three judges sat frozen in their seats, unable to process what they had just experienced. Maya's mother stood by the door with her hand over her mouth, tears running freely down her cheeks. Maya herself sat perfectly still at the piano bench, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. She looked exhausted, as if she had just run a marathon. In a way she had. Playing that piece always took everything out of her emotionally. Then something happened that nobody expected. Richard Thornwood, the famous pianist who had looked at Maya with such doubt and condescension just minutes earlier, suddenly pushed back his chair. The sound of it scraping against the floor broke the spell of silence. He stood up abruptly, and for a moment everyone thought he might be angry. But then his hands came together in a clap. And another, and another. He was applauding, his face transformed by emotion. Tears were streaming down his weathered cheeks, and he made no attempt to hide them or wipe them away. The other two judges seemed to wake from a trance. They both stood quickly, joining Thornwood in his applause. The kind woman was crying openly, not caring about her makeup running. The older man with glasses had to take his glasses off to wipe his eyes before putting them back on. Their applause filled the room, echoing off the walls. It wasn't polite, obligatory applause. It was genuine, heartfelt appreciation for something extraordinary they had just witnessed. A standing ovation in an audition room was unheard of. It had never happened in the Academy's 80-year history. But here it was, happening right now. Maya turned her head toward the sound, a look of surprise crossing her face. She hadn't expected this. She had played from her heart, yes, but part of her had still worried that it wouldn't be enough, that they would dismiss her for breaking the rules or for being too emotional rather than technically perfect. The applause continued, and slowly a smile spread across her face. Not a proud or boastful smile, but a soft, grateful one that lit up her whole expression. Thornwood walked around the judging table and approached the piano. His colleagues watched in amazement as this man, known throughout the music world for his stern demeanor and harsh criticisms, knelt down beside Maya's piano bench. He was a tall man, and kneeling brought him to her eye level. He reached out slowly and took one of her hands in both of his. His hands were trembling slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. He told her he was sorry. The words came out rough and honest, without any of the polish he usually used when speaking. He apologized for his prejudice, for his arrogance, for almost robbing the world of the gift she had to offer. He confessed that in all his years of music, in all his training and performing and teaching, he had never heard anything quite like what she had just played. He said that he had spent his entire career chasing technical perfection, believing that was what music was about. But she had just shown him something he had forgotten or maybe never truly understood. Music wasn't about playing the notes correctly. It was about touching souls, about connecting with something deeper than technique could ever reach. Maya listened to his words with that same gentle smile on her face. When he finished, she squeezed his hand lightly and said something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. She told him that everyone deserves a second chance to see things differently. Her words were simple but profound. She wasn't angry with him. She didn't hold his earlier doubts against him. She understood that people could change, could grow, could learn to see beyond their own limitations. After all, that's what her music was about. Finding light in darkness, finding hope after loss, finding beauty in unexpected places. Thornwood stood up slowly, still holding her hand for a moment before letting go. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, not embarrassed by his tears, but rather seeming freed by them. He looked at the other two judges and said clearly that Maya should receive the scholarship. More than that, he wanted to propose something unprecedented. He suggested that the Academy create a special designation just for her, something that recognized not just talent, but exceptional artistry. The kind of artistry that comes along maybe once in a generation. The other judges agreed immediately. The kind woman was already making notes on her evaluation form, her hands shaking slightly as she wrote. The older man kept nodding, saying yes over and over as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just witnessed but knew it was real. They spent the next few minutes discussing the details while Maya sat quietly, still processing everything that had happened. Her mother finally moved from her spot by the door. She walked over to Maya and wrapped her arms around her daughter, hugging her tightly. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The hug said everything. All the years of struggle, all the doubt they had faced from others, all the times people had told them Maya's dreams were impossible. All of that melted away in this moment. Maya had done it, not despite being blind, but by being exactly who she was. Before Maya and her mother left the audition room, Thornwood stopped them. He asked if he could have Maya's contact information. He wanted to stay in touch, he said. He wanted to help her develop her gift, to mentor her if she would allow it. He admitted that he had much to learn from her, even though he was supposed to be the teacher. Maya agreed, and they exchanged information. As she walked out of that room with her mother's hand on her arm and her white cane tapping the floor ahead of her, Maya had no idea just how much her life was about to change. The audition video, recorded as part of the Academy's standard procedure, sat in their files for the next few days. The admissions committee watched it multiple times, unable to believe what they were seeing and hearing. One of them mentioned it to a friend who worked in media. That friend asked to see it. Then another person asked, and another. Someone suggested sharing just a short clip online, thinking maybe a few hundred people might enjoy it. They had no idea they were about to start something that would spread across the entire world. The video appeared online on a Tuesday morning. It was just a 2-minute clip, showing the final portion of Maya's performance and the standing ovation that followed. The person who posted it wrote a simple caption about a blind girl who played from her heart at a music academy audition. They shared it thinking maybe their friends and family would watch it. Perhaps a few music lovers might stumble across it. Nobody expected what happened next. Within 24 hours, the video had been viewed 50,000 times. By the end of the week, that number had jumped to 5 million. People weren't just watching it once. They were watching it multiple times, sharing it with everyone they knew, posting it on every social media platform they used. Comments flooded in from around the world. Someone in Japan wrote that they had never cried over a video before but couldn't stop the tears. A woman in Brazil said she listened to it every morning before work, because it gave her strength to face the day. A man in Australia admitted he had been planning to give up on his own musical dreams, but Maya's story inspired him to keep trying. The video kept spreading. 10 million views. 20 million. 30 million. News outlets started picking up the story. Magazines wanted interviews. Television shows invited Maya to appear as a guest. Her phone, which usually only rang a few times a week, suddenly wouldn't stop buzzing with calls and messages. The quiet life she and her family had always known was transformed overnight into something completely different. Maya's mother had to take time off work to help manage all the attention. They were both overwhelmed and grateful at the same time. The scholarship Maya had received meant she could attend the academy, but now opportunities were appearing that they had never even dreamed of. Concert halls were reaching out, asking if Maya would perform. Recording studios wanted to produce an album of her original compositions. Publishers wanted to print her sheet music so other pianists could play her pieces. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from ordinary people around the world who felt touched by her story. Parents of blind children wrote to thank her for showing that disability didn't mean inability. Musicians who had given up their dreams years ago wrote that Maya reminded them why they fell in love with music in the first place. Teachers showed the video to their students as an example of true courage and authenticity. A hospice nurse in England said she played the video for patients in their final days, and it brought them peace. Richard Thornwood watched the video go viral with a mixture of emotions. He was proud of Maya and thrilled that the world was recognizing her gift. But he was also humbled, knowing that his own prejudice and doubt were now visible to millions of people. The way he had questioned her abilities before she played, the skeptical expression on his face, it was all there in the full version of the video that eventually got released. Some people criticized him harshly in the comments. Others defended him, saying his transformation and apology showed real character. Thornwood decided to write an essay about the experience. He titled it "The Day I Was Taught to See," and it was published in a major music journal. In it, he wrote honestly about his prejudices, his assumption that physical limitations meant artistic limitations, and how completely wrong he had been. He described the moment Maya began to play, and how it had shattered everything he thought he knew about music. He wrote about kneeling beside her and apologizing, and how her grace in accepting that apology had taught him as much as her music had. The essay was shared almost as widely as the video itself. People appreciated his honesty and his willingness to admit he had been wrong. True to his word, Thornwood became Maya's mentor. They met regularly, sometimes in person at the academy and sometimes over video calls when his concert schedule took him around the world. But their relationship wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of Thornwood teaching Maya, it often felt like the opposite. He would show her technical exercises and classical pieces, yes, but she showed him how to connect with music on a deeper level. She taught him to listen not just with his ears but with his heart. Their sessions together became as valuable to him as they were to her. The Academy held a special ceremony to officially present Maya with her scholarship and the newly created Exceptional Artist designation. The ceremony was streamed online, and over 1 million people watched live. The president of the Academy spoke about how Maya represented everything the institution valued most: dedication, passion, and the courage to share one's authentic voice with the world. When Maya gave a short acceptance speech, she was poised and humble. She thanked her parents for their support, her teachers for their guidance, and even thanked those who had doubted her because they pushed her to prove what she was capable of. 3 years passed. Maya threw herself into her studies at the academy, while also accepting select performance opportunities. She was careful not to let fame distract her from learning and growing as a musician. She continued writing original compositions, each one as honest and emotional as Light in the Darkness. She also performed classical pieces, bringing her unique interpretive style to works by Bach, Chopin, and Debussy. Critics praised her performances not for technical perfection, though her technique was excellent, but for the depth of feeling she brought to every piece she played. The biggest moment came when Maya was invited to perform at Carnegie Hall, one of the most prestigious concert venues in the world. It was a dream she had hardly dared to imagine might come true. The concert sold out within hours of tickets going on sale. People flew in from different countries to attend. The night of the performance, Maya stood backstage in a beautiful dark blue dress, feeling nervous but ready. Her mother was there, as she always was, providing quiet support. Thornwood was there too, ready to sit in the front row and watch his student take the stage. When Maya walked out onto that famous stage, guided by a stagehand to the piano, the audience rose to their feet in applause before she had even played a single note. She smiled and waved in the direction of the applause, then settled at the piano bench. The audience quieted, and in that moment of anticipation, Maya felt completely at peace. This was where she belonged. Not because she had overcome blindness or because she had become famous, but because music was her language, her way of connecting with the world and sharing what was in her heart. She played for nearly 2 hours that night. She performed several of her original compositions, including Light in the Darkness, which had started it all. She also played pieces by the great composers, breathing new life into familiar works. When she finished the final piece, the audience erupted in applause that lasted nearly 10 minutes. People were on their feet, many openly crying, all of them moved by what they had just experienced. Thornwood stood in the front row with tears streaming down his face once again. But these were tears of pure joy and pride. He thought about that day in the audition room when he had almost dismissed this remarkable young woman. He thought about how close he had come to missing out on knowing her, learning from her, being changed by her. Looking up at Maya taking her bows on stage, he felt grateful for the gift she had given not just to him but to the entire world. Maya's composition, Light in the Darkness, was eventually published and became one of the most performed contemporary piano pieces in the world. Music students learned it in conservatories across every continent. Professional pianists included it in their concert programs. Each performer brought their own interpretation to it. But everyone who heard it agreed that no performance ever quite captured the raw power and emotion of that first time Maya played it in a small audition room, pouring her heart out in front of strangers who became believers. But Maya never forgot where she came from. She continued to visit schools for blind children, encouraging them to pursue their dreams, whatever they might be. She gave free concerts at hospitals and community centers. She spoke openly about the challenges she faced and the doubts she still sometimes struggled with. She wanted people to understand that success didn't mean all your problems disappeared, or that life became easy. It just meant you kept going, kept growing, kept sharing your gifts with the world even when it was scary or difficult. Years later, when interviewers asked Maya about that famous audition, about the moment that changed everything, she always said the same thing. The real moment of transformation wasn't when the video went viral or when she performed at Carnegie Hall. It was when she made the decision to play her truth instead of what she thought people wanted to hear. That choice, made in a moment of anger and courage and hope, had opened up a whole new world, not just for her, but for everyone who heard her music and felt something wake up inside them.